then. Hello, my name is Rachel Moore. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. I want to thank everybody for tuning in for our first virtual counter narrative. So since we closed back in March, we've had to rethink how we do things, including this counter narrative. And so we're excited to start rolling out a new format for the counter narrative. So before, we used to be on a quarterly schedule where we would meet and have an hour and a half panel discussion. But I'm hoping to transition that, and we are now starting to do a monthly, quarterly topic, if that makes sense. So starting this October and running through the December, we are going to be tackling the topic of captured culture, and each month we're going to have a new conversation with new people on that topic. So we'll go ahead and get started. So this first segment is just kind of an introduction to the topic, and I'm excited to bring on our guest speaker, and that is Dr. Matthew Martinez from Ohkay Owingeh. He is the Deputy Director for the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. And I actually sought him out because of his work in reading and writing about photography and tourism in New Mexico, especially with the Pueblos. So I want to turn it over to you if you want to introduce a little bit more about yourself, Dr. Martinez.
Sangitamo, Kawatseopa, Ootamo. Good morning, greetings to my friends and relatives, and it's an honor to be here and just share some insights about the work that I've done and I've thought about, and I continue thinking about that. And it's a topic very dear to my heart when I really reflect on the power of photographs and the power of travel, and really just how that embodies our families and our tribal histories. And so I hope I can share some insights on that with you this morning. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I just kind of wanted to start this conversation off just by maybe providing a little bit of a background. I did some of my own research just kind of to lay a foundation of what film and photography actually is. So I just kind of want to run through that real quick, just because I think it's really interesting to put into context when we're talking about photography and its current uses and its history of just kind of seeing how fast that technology progressed. So just kind of defining what film is. That film is the technology to capture a real life moment or an image. And that technology kind of has its stems back into ancient civilizations with the camera obscura. If you're interested, you can read more about that. But really, the technology of actually putting it onto a silver plate, putting it into digital formats, pixels, all that kind of stuff, actually happened really quickly. The first camera actually came out in around 1885, the first majorly produced camera. By 1948, the Polaroid came out with a quick gadget that everybody could have, snapshots and Polaroids. And then the 80s, we saw the digital camera. And then by 1999, we have the first camera phones, and like the rest is history. Everybody has a camera in their pocket now. And I think that's like just having that concept of how quick this technology has come to life, I think is really cool to kind of start this conversation. So we'll go back to kind of that beginning and like the history of photography in New Mexico. So can you tell us a little bit more about that history, Dr. Martinez?
Yeah, and you mentioned this word regarding capture, right? So you're actually taking something. And so let's kind of reflect on what that means to really capture and record an image. The very act of that is an action, right? There's something that is exchanged when you take and you're receiving that. And in this case is obviously imagery, but where does that imagery come from? And what's not in the picture is also part of the photograph, right? And so you have early travelers that came in the late 1880s, early 1900s, really looking for a new place, regarding westward expansion, a new place to travel that was very different from Midwest and East Coast sensibilities. And so Native peoples, and in particular Pueblo peoples, really became that subject matter as an exotic other, so to speak, as a place so different, but not only as people, but just a landscape that was strikingly different from the rest of mainstream America at that particular time. And it's also important to note that in the late 1800s, regarding this capturing, there really was that sense from the U.S. government in the hunt for, quote, Geronimo as somebody who was evading U.S. Army forces. You get the capturing of Native kids being shipped off to the boarding schools in the late 1800s. And so the idea of taking children and placing them in Western schools and Western sensibilities where English was only to be spoken, where they were schooled in these value systems of what it meant to be a good American, what it meant to be civilized. And so you get US government policy really focusing on this capturing um, actions, right? And so the photographs and the visual documentations really become kind of a counterpart to what is actually happening on the ground um, in tribal communities at that time. And so there's a lot of stories about, boarding school kids, runaway boys, resisting, teachers and sort of government officials at that time. But we also know that New Mexico became a relatively new state, right, in 1912. And this factors in really significantly of how New Mexico was marketed as a safe place for people to build a new home in a way that um, that is different from the quote nomadic raiding other tribes in the plains. And so Pueblos really become kind of a quote, a peaceful, civilized subject matter. And you see that in early postcards and photography. And you get these descriptions that Pueblos are quaint, they're curious, they love dancing, they're colorful. All of this gets wrapped in particular imageries and postcards. So that really sparks the imagination of trying to capture these images and really just marketing the state as a place, because one of the reasons why it took New Mexico to come into statehood later is that there was a lot of federal discussion with congressional representatives that it was too dangerous, it was uncivilized, and quote, there were too many savages and Mexicans living in the region, and that's not part of our America. And this is direct congressional testimony, as problematic as it is. So the camera and the visual really becomes a way to kind of tame and capture a place in this quest for statehood.
I had no idea all of that. That's kind of crazy that, I also think about the history and just like that people just our existence here has always been such a other thing. That's always, when people come in, it's just like, oh, this is ours to take, and like you're here and you guys are all right. I think about like even when the Spanish first came and, being able to grant Pueblos sovereignty in that way of just being like, well, capturing that civility that is defined by Western culture, and really being able to use like the camera's use in that to spread the word about that. But I think also like the next step that I am really marked by that just kind of hits me, besides like the statehood piece, but also just the tourism piece. I think you mentioned like the postcards and stuff. And I always remember the first time I saw that ad for like the train company when it came through, and it was like, come see Indians as, Columbus found them, and just how much photography was used in pieces like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole narrative about the exoticness of Native people here. You know, particularly with the railroads coming in, and then later with the Fred Harvey detours, where people were really taken out and these field trips to experience dances, to buy authentic Indian art, and experience something really up close to uh, again an experience that was very different from where people came from. And these are larger practices of how museums came to be, of collecting others, right? And
Mhm.
so world trade fairs were famous for projecting this ladder of civilization of Black people, of brown people, and this progressive way of where people came to be, and this ladder. And then you get people like Edward Curtis, one of the most famous photographers, who made it his life career to document and photograph Native peoples, because he thought they were going to be vanishing, and so he wanted to just really capture every tribe as they were in their quote authentic setting. And we know that a lot of those photographs were positioned in ways that made him seem more authentic. You get plains regalia placed on some on Pueblo people, and vice versa. And so, he obviously didn't know a lot of those nuances, but we can recognize that, those are really invented and forced images that, became popular and part of our American imagination of how natives are supposed to be authentic.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, especially how it affects like museums, because working for the Culture Center and a lot of our exhibits, we rely on some of those older photographs, and I've always found it difficult to figure out what could be used and what should be used, because you can look at something and say, wait, that like these things are not right. There's extra things that were brought into this image that really shouldn't be there, and really how it adds to that romanticized notion of who we actually are. And I think that's really interesting to get to the root of, let's see, where was I going to go with this? Um, just kind of the implications of that anthropological view of photography and how it affects our identity today. Um, because I think about how often, and especially the more I leave New Mexico, how there is that perception of just like, well, you're not native, you're not wearing a headdress, and just kind of that there is that skewed idea of like what natives look like because of these 1800 photographs. But then also, you have the contemporary uses of photography. People like Cara Romero or Lee Marmon, who are from or from Native communities, who use their art in a new way to promote a new perspective. But how those still don't jive. Like people still just look at those black and white photos as reference rather than the contemporary ones, at least in my perspective right now. I don't know if you have anything different to say.
Yeah, Lee Marmon needs to be credited for the body of work that he created, because he was really just about documenting and kind of capturing uh, his community and families as they were. I mean, they didn't really need to be positioned in any other ways, and if that meant wearing regular jeans and shirts, then that's who they were as Native people. And so we know his iconic image of white man's moccasins, right?
Hmm.
Um, that this man is wearing Converse tennis shoes, and so he captured that. He took a photograph of that, and that was a moment in thinking about having a Native person in front of the camera and behind the camera. And so that was a particular shift in the 1940s of how natives began to imagine themselves. And you get the several other images of that, regarding, capturing people and their regular places, and that's who they are as natives. Um, and so, riding the wave up into the 60s and 70s, you get a stronger sense of agency and self-determination, and but Lee Marmon has to be credited for making that conscious shift, and really the power of the camera that he recognized in the 1940s. Um, I grew up listening to stories that my father and my aunts would share with us, just casual conversations that always stuck with me, that um, they were kids there at Ohkay Owingeh in front of the church, and they knew that tourists would stop there on the way up to Taos. And there was a general store in the village that sold kind of just handy goods, day-to-day hardware stuff. But they also had a section of candy. And so they would pose for tourists coming in, and get their photographs taken. And the tourists would give him nickels or pennies, a tip him for the day or whatever. And it was a lot back in the 1940s and 50s, to just have a couple of nickels, and you could buy penny candy for the whole family and all your friends. And so the idea that you get your picture taken, there was a value exchange. And I think at that time people didn't really understand the impact of tourism. But those stories always stood in my mind of, man, what were tourists coming to look at as they drive through northern New Mexico? And more than anything, I would love to have some of those photographs as my father as a boy, and my aunts and them. And so that's just part of how family connect their histories of what matters in the particular moments, right?
Yeah. I like how you bring up the value exchange because I think in your chapter in the book, The Framed World, you bring up a section about how in those early anthropology days, 1800s, when you give the example of Zuni, and how some of the elders, they saw the value of that exchange, and how they were able to shape what they did. But also, like, I think for me, that's kind of a jumping off point to really dive into that a power exchange between the rights of the photographer and the photographed, that word. And just kind of who gains the most power in that situation, especially when we're looking at history and even in today, because I'm kind of putting this in context of, we're going to talk a little bit later about Pueblo etiquette and just kind of why we ask people not to photograph certain things, and really just that we want to maintain the power of those images, that material. But in certain instances that, just like your parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles example of just like, they gained something out of it that was a benefit to them, but also maybe in the long run could be a benefit to their children, their grandchildren of, these photographs can pop up and be like, oh yeah, that's my great great grandmother, and being able to have that tangible connection to the past that is a little bit more realistic. So what do you think about that dynamic of change and power and rights of who's involved?
Well, I think that definitely matters as far as the control of these images. And obviously historically, images of natives have been strategically used to market New Mexico. And we can look at the New Mexico Magazine and a whole series of other state tourism produced uh, projects that always feature natives on the front covers. About 80 or 90% of imagery are natives. Um, and it's, again, as a feathered cultural icon. And part of the project that I looked at was, what happens, or how does that narrative shift when natives are in control of that production and that exchange that we just talked about. And I mentioned that Lee Marmon was one of those moments in time that shifted. But there are many other spokes to this larger wheel of shifting narratives when that control is exerted. Um, and that really matters, because it's a way to highlight communities, and a responsible ethnic language, right? So one thing that the photographs do is It allows people to interpret what those images are, but they're not written languages. It's a visual language, right? And so, what does that come across to people when you have natives dressed in regular clothes and tennis shoes, or kids playing basketball? They're still native, right? I mean, the identity doesn't shift, but it's marked differently from these exchanges. And I think that's really the exciting part of the work that's happening and unfolding very quickly is when it comes to imagery and cameras, is that there's a constant shift, but that value system of being native and centered remains.
That's really cool. Um, and thinking about just kind of as we're progressing and being able to shift that narrative, but also just the fact that there's more access to these things, because there is the shift in narrative, but there's also, now we're faced with the fact of, everybody has a camera. And so, that capturing piece of, I think about, again, referencing that Pueblo etiquette and how when we take members to a Pueblo feast day and we warn them repeatedly of like, hey, don't bring out your cameras, just out of respect for the ceremony. We ask you not to take pictures of anything, just leave your phone. Like if you're seen with it, it will be taken away. And we've had that happen to a number of members and they were upset with us, and it was just like, well, that's our right to have control over our own images. And so it's kind of an interesting power dynamic when you think about how we're trying to change a narrative, but at the same time, there's people that are wanting to hold on to that old style of just like, oh, I'm going to capture the mystery and the mysticism.
Yeah, right. Because I think the larger American narrative is invested in these colonial practices of what is authentic, and particularly between Santa Fe and Taos are really high tourist places. Um, and the idea of taking a photograph really captures your experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's tangible that, look, I visited these places, um, and this is what I've seen. And so not only from a New Mexico tourism, but think of it from a larger framework. If we travel to New York or other places, absolutely the larger kind of human activity and practice is to just capture these moments where you can share these stories back with your friends and family. And so tourism really is an interesting contentious practice because it lends itself to all these narratives that are kind of a slippery slope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we want to travel, we want to have fun, and that's what capturing photographs is all about, is about play and enjoyment. And that really doesn't always translate when we have particular community ceremonies or activities. It's not theatrical production, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not for the tourist gaze, so to speak. There's a different sensibility operating there. So how does that translate to back home and really controlling on the ground of times where cameras are really not appropriate? Um, yeah.
And I think that's a big question I have. So, background, I forgot to introduce my tribe. I'm from Hopi, and it's just kind of funny because, I have a lot of family that likes to share photos, share videos. I think just at the beginning of the year, there was a ceremony that my cousins just started spreading like wildfire because they're just like, oh, I miss being home. And like, they were able to connect and they were excited to see that. But on the opposite side of the coin, there's those concerns of just like, you're putting something so important to us in a public format that is hard to reel back. And then you have instances, for example, a couple of years ago, we had a discussion about, the Boy Scouts of America, and how, their appropriation of some of this stuff. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic to think about and construct of just um, having something captured, and then other people capturing what they want out of that capturing. It's just kind of like this nesting egg that it gets less and less pure the farther away it gets as people nitpick what they want and smash together weird things. And um, I think it's a difficult thing, especially because, I have that personal connection, or um, I think about like my personal connection to my community. I am a product um, of American colonization. I'm a product of, oh, what's that word called? Not indoctrination, but uh, becoming part of American society. My mom is not deeply connected to community, and I'm trying to find those connections. And it's interesting to have those opportunities, to have those photographs, to have those videos, to have something to talk to somebody about and be like, okay, this is part of who I am. I'm wanting to learn more, and this is a really great opportunity for me from New Mexico to access my Arizona connections. But then you also have people that will take it the wrong way and just be like, I want to take a piece of this just because I like this part and I don't care what it means. So it's kind of an interesting fine line. And I think that's what I would like to kind of tease out more and just kind of learn more from other people, just their perspective on that, because there is that fine line of just like what is helpful to record and share, and where's the line of sharing, especially in a global internet.
Yeah, I think those are really, really big questions. Thinking about the line, right? And that's your ethical compass, right?
Mhm.
And internally we might feel something that's not right to capture, or sometimes even be in a particular place. If there's only tribal members that are there, or only men, or whatever the situation is. And so it's that internal ethical compass that I think most natives tune into, and not those aren't really translatable in English terms to the outside public. And for travel guidebooks, and I'm sure on your Indian public cultural website you have a list of feast days and events that are open. And so one is to educate the public of what those dates are. Um, but at home, at Ohkay Owingeh, we have so many other events besides our main feast day. So our main feast day is June 24th, and that's a high time as far as dances and food vendors, and really community and tourists coming in. But that's just one day and one moment in a particular calendar. There's so much that goes on throughout the year, um, and every day, right? Our everyday connections to place, and really honoring that. And pueblos are much more than just particular feast days, um, and um, and so that's also part of this larger seasonal calendar, but also the human calendar of where we are. And you mentioned that these photographs can become stories, and they're examples of your place and your community in Hopi. Um, but I think the real, one of the ways to look at that is the relationship, right?
Mhm.
Your relationship to your family and to your community is what matters. Um, so even if you didn't have a photograph, you still have that connection to place and home, and that's really the value there. And you get a lot of communities that are struggling to understand relationships, because not everybody lives within their tribal boundaries. But that doesn't diminish who you are from being a particular a member from a tribe, from a family, from a clan. So these relationships are in layers, right?
Mhm.
And so I also think about these days, because those tend to be very public. The dances you have there at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center are public social dances that are stories that can be shared to the traveling public. But there's obviously a lot of dances that aren't able to be taken out of villages, that only happen in particular places and times of year. And there's reasons for that based on our own tribal protocols. And and sometimes, they're open to the public, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're private, or they're held at night in a particular space, very intimate spaces. And so, but that's all of us. We're all part of that, of understanding these cultural traditions, that is often not in plain sight of the traveling public. And so, I think it's a privilege that the public really gets to have a sense of that, and at museums and public performances. But that's really just obviously scratching the surface of who we are as Indigenous peoples, right?
Hmm. I think that's just, for me, just the way you said that is a really great way to kind of put into context, especially if we're referencing, those instances of very frequent misappropriations based off of imagery and things like that. I just had a conversation with my father-in-law about the changing of mascots, and how he was just like, well, I don't get what the big deal is. Like, it's just a name. And I was like, it's not just a name, it's about what goes behind the name. It's like you have a lot more people that are, because their favorite football team is named the Chiefs, they feel like it's their right to, don chief wear. And it's like, there's a lot more that goes into being a chief and earning the rights to have that, wear that kind of stuff, or to be that way, or, and then just, making it feels like being made fun of, to have people paint their faces red just to, jive with that stereotypical image that they have in their heads. And so, um, it's a really interesting slope to think about photos as a tool that is frequently referenced for misappropriation. And I think, if we go back far enough, referencing again that those anthropologists, Edward Curtis, who posed things without understanding those connections. And so, um, it's very interesting history to put into context that it's lasted for so long, but the contemporary implications of some of those things, like the mascots or tourism. So.
Yeah, I just, the mascots is, we can have a whole other session on that too. And I love sports, and we have a couple of TVs at home, and we have usually football on one or baseball on the other, and my son and I, engage in all of that activity. I have family members that are Redskins fans and Chiefs fans, so it gets very contentious. As far as ownership, right? Ownership to particular images,
Mhm.
and that's really what it's about, is the power of being able to hold on to a moment and a very appropriated image of what it is to have a chief, right?
Mhm.
And that's really just this idea of this American imagination of how tribes have been treated over time. Um, but really the idea of the cowboy and Indian dynamic, and we really have to look into history of how it came to be. Um, but we know Indians are not mascots, right? And so that's obviously the issue here. Um, and now October and November, I get calls, or my staff get calls, because of, they want a speaker for, used to be Columbus Day, changed to Indigenous Peoples Day. So what do we honor? Can you help us with class presentations um, for this day? Obviously Halloween, right? There's always the option of dressing up as an Indian. November, Native American Month, right? There's a lot of programming that happens around November.
Mhm.
And then there are still schools today who dress their kids up as pilgrims and Indians. And, but hopefully that's slowly, going away. But it's a high seasonal time to to dress up and to really recognize Indian culture, Native culture during these particular months. And so, again, back to my original point is that this is every day of the year. It's not a one day and it's not 1 month, but it's ever continuous of that. And I think schools need to recognize that, not only in their New Mexico and U.S. history courses, but how do you talk about indigenous knowledge and incorporate that into your chemistry classes? The firing of pottery, there's a chemistry that happens there. So how do you build that into indigenous knowledge systems in a way that you can understand science, right? Um, and so it doesn't always have to be New Mexico history or one culture day of the year, but indigenous knowledge is embedded in all these manifestations of how we understand schools and learning systems.
Before we go down into a deeper rabbit hole, because like appropriation is a whole big thing that just would take a lot of unpacking. But you also referenced just as far as like the ownership of images, and I'm reminded of the controversy back in 2011. I don't know if you remember reading about this. It was the photographer who his camera was stolen by a monkey, and the monkey was fiddling around with it and managed to take a selfie. And then the photographer was able to get the camera back, and he actually published the photograph. And it was just like, he started making money off of it, but there's a whole backstory about how he ended up giving it back to, save the monkeys and charities and stuff like that. But then there was a whole PETA thing that was like, hey, you're infringing on the rights of the monkey because the monkey took his picture and that's his monkey. And it's just like the rights of ownership and the rights of sharing, I think, is kind of a good thing to come back to when you're talking about appropriation, and just again referencing, like, I think little pieces of everything that we've talked about so far. But I think copyrights is kind of a little localized thing that we can discuss that maybe some people don't understand fully what that is.
Yes, so it's obviously a very contested realm when you think about who owns an image, who owns a story or a piece of music, and that we see that played out in the media as far as artists, stealing music or lyrics, and so that's really one area of copyright. So legally, the copyright belongs to the one who created the image, but you also have to have permission of individuals to use their photograph and to take their photograph. And so that's one of the challenges of people coming in, um, tourism and travelers to New Mexico, is that Native peoples aren't props. They're real people. They're real dynamic members of the community. And so, what would happen if I go into Arizona or Colorado and enter a gated community and take photographs of children on the playground, right? Or in a park? I would, I'm sure the law enforcement would be there in a heartbeat. But people don't think twice of doing that in our own particular communities, of taking photographs of children without proper permission. And so, it's interesting of how these dynamics of agency get played out um, according to the ownership of cameras and who has access to that. Um, One of my other chapters that I did in my dissertation was interviewing artists under the Portal program in Santa Fe. And so that is probably one of the most visited places in the state, where people can come in and buy jewelry, pottery, other quote authentic Native art, because they go through a demonstration process that they make the art themselves, and they're using real silver, real turquoise, and so there's an authenticity practice going on there. But in my conversations with the artists there, I just said, what's that like talking with tourists and visitors? And, they say, I have a whole list of examples, but one of them is like, people are amazed that we speak English and that we can converse with the public, and that we're articulate and we can, talk about the work that we've done. So one is the notion of speaking English. Um, and then my friend Chris Chavez from Santo Domingo talks about, one time one of the ladies, I guess she must have been from the East Coast coming in, and she's like, "You're a real Indian. Where are your feathers? Where are your feathers if you're a real Indian?" And he's like, "I said I'm an Indian. I didn't say I was a chicken." And so and so it's just like, he has a real and a lot of those artists who sell under the porch are used to these questions, and they're very entertaining, and they once they get an opportunity to say something back, that's part of the agencies. You really speak back to the narrative, right? Feathers aren't only a native thing, but obviously the idea of being not being a chicken, right? And so I just remember that, and it cracks me up. And so um, the idea of what people have of native people coming into the Southwest is a very different dynamic. And we're in 2020, right? I mean, and these narratives persist and endure. Um, and that's the backdrop that we're all trying to navigate.
I always think about being here at the Culture Center, especially high tourist season, Balloon Fiesta, and American Indian Week, when powwow's happening, and just how many people come through. And I'm always I always get slightly uncomfortable, but I also am trying to like get used to it. And I'm sure these artists are more used to it, of just like a lot of these people coming in, and if I'm welcoming them at the door, they're just like, "Are you a real Indian?" Or yeah, it's like, "Yeah, I'm from Hopi," and it's just like, "Can I get a picture?" It's like getting a picture with a celebrity, and it's like, that's weird. It's like you just want a picture of me just because I said I'm Native American. And it's just like, that's so weird. It's like, and sometimes I don't give them permission just because of, certain internal feelings. But that's just something that, even in 2020 being faced with, I think is funny with, the prolificness of photos and photography is just, that idea, and being able to break that idea with, I'm somebody who is, dressed in contemporary clothes, but I'm Native American, so they can go back and say like, "Look, I got a picture with a real Native American." um and I had something else, but I got sidetracked with that story. It might come back.
Yeah, and it's the idea that they're able to capture your authenticity, and that there's proof that they were there, right? So that the photograph serves as that proof. And I can imagine the stories that they tell back to their friends and family when they show them the photograph, or they share it on social media, because that's also this new forum of engagement, right? That anybody can comment and share photos and go viral, and so it takes a life and energy of its own, apart from the original intention of that. And so that's really just the power of media, is that there's a continuous vast transformation of these images.
How do you feel about just like that change in meet, like as things progress on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter? Like, how do you perceive that when, like, if somebody takes a photograph in Ohkay Owingeh?
So it depends. I mean, we've generally been pretty open about allowing photographs for some public dances. There are also very strict times of the year where it's absolutely not allowed, and cameras get confiscated. I've been a part of that enforcement at home, where we've had to physically remove cameras, cell phones, block roads according to what is happening. And it's really just not that we don't want any outsiders or visitors, but whatever is happening requires a time and space of its own. and just that moment as an intimate space for whatever is happening. And so 90% of people are understanding, but you get a couple of knuckleheads that are adamant about photographing, taking pictures, and it can get very contentious. And so we always know um, when that happens that you go in pairs, right? And so if there's anything that ever happens, there's a witness. We've been threatened to be sued. This is my property. You have no rights to take away our phones or our cameras. Um, but people quickly forget, the sovereignty of whose land they're on. And so, that does happen. And I think that happens in most tribes on some level. And so we try to educate the public by putting signs up or posting things on our websites. And I know other museums and visitors centers are good about sharing the rules and regulations. Um, but it just comes down to respect, right? If you don't know if photographs are allowed or if it's open to the public, ask um, a call ahead of time. And it's just having that basic sense of understanding and not a sense of entitlement that you're there and it's a performance for you to capture and record and take photos, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
That's you see a lot of those comics or those jokes. I don't know if you've seen the one where it's just kind of these parents that their child is born and all of a sudden the cameras are out and they're taking pictures of the kid, and so then eventually later down the comic the kid just recognizes their parents as the camera in front of their face. um, and I think there's like underrated value that I think as a society we've lost of just being able to experience a moment. I know that's probably I was a photographer back in high school and early college. That's actually what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into photojournalism. But I found that I don't enjoy being stuck behind the camera. It's just like it's kind of like always living in the past. There's a value in moments where you want to have that, but then there's also those moments of just like this is meant to be experienced now at this time, not in perpetuity. So I'm thinking more so just like that experience of being calm and in the moment, not to sound yogi or anything like that, but just being able to take part in those moments as they are, and being respectful for that time and place, and not being stuck behind the camera because they are so easy to use and easy to capture and hold on to past moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you summed that up really, really well. But we also created a whole generation of technology where cameras really are another part of your body, right? I mean, they're always tied to hands and in your pocket or whatever. And so we need to obviously recognize that too. And I guess I think about you mentioned Cara Romero. There's a ton of native photographers that have really just been influencers, right?
Mhm.
Halia Senegini, Navajo photographer, has really used the camera to document stories and celebrate women and empowerment. Ricardo Cate, he's not a photographer, but he's a cartoonist, and
He's
so
also
he,
dabbling in film these days too.
yeah, I hear that. So
Yeah.
that's, he's, has quite a platform and followers, not only to educate about the contemporary experiences of Native people, but just to kind of put a mirror to society and reflective, social commentary. What is really happening here with elected officials, sports team mascots. I mean, his topics are vast, and he has quite a following and readership, and I appreciate those practices of him, painters. other filmmakers who are really kind of turning the camera on society and having all of us think about what is actually happening and reframing that. Hopefully, there's a reframing and a takeaway of a deeper understanding when these actions happen.
Awesome. I hope that these conversations will be helpful to everybody that's participating and listening. Um, I think that's a really great way to kind of end off. So we'll go ahead and turn and I would invite everybody to participate in the upcoming conversations. Like I said, these are going to continue throughout the rest of the quarter, so November and December. On November 18th, we're going to have our next discussion, and we're actually going to have a Zoom webinar. So if you want to sign up on our website to participate, we have up to 100 people that can participate, and this will be a discussion with dance performers, Ria Thundercloud from Sandia Ho-Chunk, and oh, I feel like I'm missing one for tribes, and Fernando Silicion from Zuni. He's a traditional performer who dances in our courtyard. So we'll be excited to have a discussion with them. So we invite everyone to kind of submit their questions, especially understanding some of this background that Dr. Martinez has been able to share with us. In December, we're also lining up another conversation with some of these artists who work in film and photography or, paint similar types of materials. So look forward to that. Feel free to connect with us on our website, social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're on all those platforms, Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And I just want to leave it, Dr. Martinez, if you want to shout out anything in particular, especially with MIAC or anything.
Yeah, thank you for having me and hosting these topics. When we initially started the conversation, the idea was to have an in-person forum and panel, and I missed the interaction and kind of the question and answer from the audiences, and maybe one day we can get back to that. But if anything that COVID has done, it's really shed light on the inequities in the state regarding access to technology and healthcare. And I really wish our all of our communities and our families good health and well-being, considering the times that we're all in. And so I haven't been able to visit with my relatives as much as I can. And so definitely shout out to my Aunt Josephine, my Aunt Mercedes, my Uncle Hank, everybody at home. I have a sixth grade son who is on his virtual learning, and shout out to my son Malachi, and just kind of just hanging in there despite our challenging times. I know there's a lot of the discussion about virtual and hybrid and in person, and things can get a little overwhelming looking at all of that. But we really got to think about learning happens all the time, and to really stay connected to who you are despite these challenging times. And so I wish my friends and family good health. Up at MIAC at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, we just recently opened to the public at 25% capacity. And so we're slowly kind of dipping our toes into the water, so to speak. But take a look at our website, indianartsandculture.org, for our upcoming exhibits and our online programming. And I appreciate our relation with the Indian Public Cultural Center. And that's what we have to do, is collaborate and think about these larger initiatives, because we're all trying to figure it out. And so thank you for hosting these.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to talk to you more often. And again, you're welcome to join us for the upcoming conversations.
Absolutely.